Professor Wolff, always great to see you, sir. Thank you for taking this time with me.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mitch.
I understand economic warfare is not new, not by a long shot, as old as war itself, I assume. But Russia has been cut off financially, economically, publicly, privately, from the financial world. It just seems to me we have entered into a new kind of financial warfare that might be unique to our modern day. I don't even know what to call it. I'm not the economist. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think in some way you've said it very well. It is old, but parts of it are new. It is a continuation of American foreign policy, that is the sanctions and the imposition of this coordinated, let's call it economic warfare, for lack of a better term. It's old, it's new, but it is being touted with a level of hysterical propagandistic hype that really needs paring down, just so that we have our feet on the ground as we talk about the crisis that once again we're in. Because what we're doing here is a kind of, well, let me remind you, back in the Vietnam War, back in the early days of Afghanistan, Iraq, the United States was full of pictures on television at night of quote unquote smart bombs. I don't know if you remember all of that. You probably reported on it. It later turned out that these bombs were smart sometimes and really stupid and mistaken other times, that they depend on intelligence, which is gathered by people with a very diverse set of motivations, and et cetera, and that the military was celebrating endless victories, which weren't endless and which often weren't victories. They were hiding again, I don't think the United States is probably much worse about this than other countries, but it is no better either. And it should have taught a generation to be really dubious about the claims of success and the hidden failures. And this is obviously being played out right now as we go through this experience. And I thought it might be useful for you and your audience to get some, I don't know, reality check here, to spend a little bit of time explaining what's actually going on, reducing it to the actual dimensions it has, to the contradictions it displays. So there's less of a collapse when it turns out that the hype we're going through was exactly that. So if you will, let me do a little of it to start off. The sanctions are devoted to Russia so far, overwhelmingly. Okay, let's take a look at what that means. What is the GDP of Russia? How big an economy is it? And the answer is the most recent statistics indicate that the gross domestic product, the total output of goods and services in Russia, is in the neighborhood of $1.5 trillion. Okay? The United States, which is the leader in imposing every conceivable kind of sanction on this country, has a GDP of larger than $21 trillion. In other words, this is not a fight between equals. This is not even a fight between unequals. This is, in economic language, David and Goliath, and I won't need to explain which side is which in the biblical parallel. But it's worse than that. Why? Because allied with the United States in this effort to punish Russia are Germany now, Britain now, and many of the other Western European countries. So let me give you a sense of their size. I'll start with Germany. What's the GDP of Germany? 3.8 trillion. So it's itself more than twice the size of Russia, and it's allied with the United States, which is 15 times the size of Russia. And I haven't even begun. Italy, a small European country, has a larger GDP than Russia. Italy's is 1.9 trillion. Russia's is 1.5. So if you add up the countries allied with the United States, it's not just David versus Goliath. It's David versus three Goliaths all merged into one. It is a grotesque, unequal struggle. Let's keep that really in mind because it changes the dynamic. You can demonize Mr. Putin, and I'm not here to defend him, but you can demonize him from here to tomorrow. But it's an extraordinary thing for a world leader like he is to be in as weak an economic position as he was and is, and still do what he did. You can ask the honest question, why would he do this? What must have been the stakes for people like him? And he's surrounded by a bevy of advisors and all the rest, as all these leaders are. The decisions are never made by them as individuals. And that's why they're at the top of that bureaucracy, precisely because they've understood that all their lives. The same would be true of a Biden or of an Obama and all the rest. So there must have been enormous issues for them to undertake a struggle of this size. So let's keep that in mind and answer the question. Well, will then these sanctions work? And the interesting answer to the question is, we don't know. That's the only honest answer. Anyone who tells you that these sanctions are a guarantee of success is either ignorant or someone you should stop talking to. And let me explain very simply. We have been an overwhelming David-Goliath situation with the island of Cuba since 1960-61. That's over half a century devoted to getting rid of that regime and that government. And that program of sanctions was and remains a failure. That ought to make you hesitant about what sanctions can and cannot do. Much the same is true of Iran now. For a long time, we have not gotten rid of the Ayatollahs that run that country, of its nuclear program, of its alliances. The sanctions haven't worked. Have they hurt the society? Absolutely. Sanctions do. But you have to remember, and I always find this strange with Americans, you have to remember, how do you think Americans would react if we were on the receiving end of economic squeezes designed to get us to make big internal changes? I bet an awful lot of Americans would like to say, and they may well be correct, that their backs would stiffen, their anger would grow, their resourcefulness in getting around and evading and frustrating these sanctions would be redoubled. And who knows whether they might not be successful in doing that. That's exactly what has happened in Iraq. It's what has happened in Cuba. It's what happened, if you go back further, to the attempt to do that in North Korea, and so on. So the history of sanctions isn't very good. Why? Well, there are two reasons. Number one, and less important, but I want to mention it, is that the world has now gone through a good half century of repeated economic warfare. I would look at my examples: North Korea, Cuba, Iraq, Iran, so forth. So we are now in a world that has learned how to do this. In other words, the element of surprise in a sanction program has long disappeared. There are, I won't go into detail, but there are all kinds of firms around the world, accounting firms, law firms, banking firms, indirect financial firms who make a living, and a good one, by helping the objects of sanction get around the sanction. This is now a profession, and the Russians will have had much experience since they've been getting these sanctions pretty much as long as I can remember, one way or another, and they've gotten around them. They are experts. Doesn't mean that they will succeed this time. It doesn't deny that this is a more comprehensive program of sanctions, but it should give pause to people who believe there is something extraordinarily powerful going on. But the more important reason is the following. We now have a more internationally connected economic system than this planet we live on has ever seen. Goods are produced in one corner of the world, they're processed in another corner, they're packaged in still a third corner, and they are marketed through intermediaries in still yet another corner of the world. Shipping is moving vast amounts of material while it pollutes the oceans, etc., etc. Therefore, any disruption of this system, as we have been learning in recent years, ramifies, and it ramifies around the world in ways too complicated for most people to understand, let alone accommodate. Let me give you a simple example. The Ukraine, the country we call the Ukraine, or I'm sorry, I've been corrected. I should call it Ukraine, no the in front of it. My apologies. Ukraine is part of the automobile production system in Europe. That is, virtually every European automaker either has production facilities in Ukraine or depends on things that were produced in Ukraine. And the result has been, because of the Russian invasion, that the production and export from Ukraine to the Western European car makers and those that are located elsewhere in Eastern Europe has been disrupted. Likewise, the export of automobiles from Western Europe to Russia has been halted for all practical purposes as part of this U.S. coordinated sanction. Well, what's the result? The result is that production in places like Volkswagen and Audi in Germany, or any other of the European countries, BMW, Daimler-Benz, any of the major producers, has been disrupted all over Europe. Production has been cut back. One of the inevitable results of producing a smaller supply of European cars drives up the price of those cars, because that's what producers do. When the supply goes down, the demand is still there. They see that as an opportunity to raise prices. Plus, with these disruptions, they're losing money, and they need to offset the lost money by jacking up the prices of what they have to sell. In a rising inflationary environment in Europe, raising automobile prices is a very bad result for Western Europe. Number two, because they're not shipping cars to Russia, where are the cars being sold in Russia going to come from? Where are they already coming from? Answer, the People's Republic of China, which is now taking over the Russian market. Western Europeans are losing what we call market share inside Russia, a significant market for them, and the Chinese are gaining market share in a part of Europe where they did not have that kind of opportunity before. Last point, and then I'll stop. Unlike previous David and Goliath, there's now not a Goliath, but half a Goliath standing in the wings, and that's the People's Republic of China. If you recall the numbers I began with, 1.5 trillion GDP for Russia, 3.8 for Germany, 1.9 for Italy, and the United States with over 21, then the Chinese become important because their GDP is about $14 trillion. So they're kind of halfway between. And they are allied with Russia. That gives the Russians a support in this program of sanctions that is, at the very least, a wild card. It's precisely why we cannot know anything like what the outcome of these sanctions is going to be because of the uncertainties having to do with the support the Chinese have already given, with the support the Chinese have promised to give, and with the likelihood that the United States has very little bargaining power because of what Mr. Trump did and what the Democrats did not oppose, namely in making an enemy out of the Chinese by imagining that a trade war and a tariff war that the Trump administration imposed and that the Biden administration continues, which, by the way, is another example of sanction program that did not succeed. The Chinese did not let it do what the Americans said it would. And therefore, I would have to say that the only honest discussion today has to do with wondering, because we can't do more than that, whether this hyped up economic warfare is really a plan to win something, or maybe to drive the Russians back out of Ukraine, or whether it is, and I say this with all humility, but there's no way out of this, that the Russians must have had extraordinary reasons to risk what they've done. And the United States may be desperately trying to defeat what they did, but lacking the resources to do it. So we're going to have an enormous theater of activity, sanction after sanction, new ones every few days. This one is going to really do it. That one is going to do it. It's beginning to sound like the desperate communications from military people out in Afghanistan, how this surge was going to really do it. And this new surge will really, after a while, people stop paying attention because the hype loses its rationale.
There's a few things I want to follow up with you in that. The first, the David and Goliath comparison. I heard a voice in my head as you were saying that say, well, some people are going to say that Russia is also a Goliath compared to Ukraine, considering how much more militarily superior it is to Ukraine's military. But that said, let me also add that I get the principle. If we were to have sort of an international standard, if a country were to invade another sovereign country that wasn't immediately about to attack it, that the world collectively would respond against the aggressor country. That would be a great way, I think, to stop war almost altogether. But of course, we know that wouldn't be applied equally. The United States has its own history of invading countries when it was not under imminent threat from that country. It's almost unimaginable that would happen to the United States, say back in 2003 when we invaded Iraq, or 2001 when we invaded Afghanistan. So I guess it gets to this issue is, again, I could respect a principle that if a country attacks another country globally, internationally, they are hobbled financially to have a penalty for that, to try to stop it from happening. But we know it won't be applied equally.
Absolutely. I mean, let's take your point a step further. When the United States invaded either Iraq or Afghanistan, and there are many other examples that we could also point to, but put it aside for a moment, just those two, nobody mobilized an international economic warfare against the United States. China didn't. Russia didn't. No countries did. I mean, this was an observation of what the power in the world at that time was. Not only could the United States invade, and the notion that that two of the poorest countries on this planet, Iraq and Afghanistan, represented a threat militarily, culturally, economically, politically to the United States is simply laughable. Despite the efforts that you may remember before the invasion of Iraq to portray Saddam Hussein as a modern day Hitler, kind of like what is being done apropos Putin now. And not to say that there aren't things that can be appropriately criticized in those leaders as well. But the point is, we are in a new place. We're in a new place. And that's why I said what I said at the bottom. Take a step back and ask yourself, wow, the United States is establishing something like a step in your direction, Mitch. It is, in fact, teaching the world that maybe when you're desperate enough, you need to mobilize the world's economic resources to crush somebody who may be weak enough to be crushable. But you may also unleash a program of economic warfare among all kinds of people who are going to look at the American experiment. If the U.S. succeeds in its sanctions, you can be sure that every country on earth will be re-examining whether and how it can weaponize its economic relationships with the rest of the world to achieve political and other kinds of objectives. You know, there's a long history in the world of capitalism that argues the economy is much better off without government intervention than with it. Now, in the patriotic euphoria of our time now, all of that old wisdom is out the window. But we may come to recognize that there was always a grain of truth there, if indeed it was often hyped. But the grain of truth is, be careful whether you succeed in what you are doing, because you may come to be very, very sorry that you did so. And let me be clear, will the Chinese, upon whom every day that we're speaking, more and more of the world is dependent, including the United States, will they weaponize their economic relationships? If the Chinese do not send us the rare earths that we now import from them, what happens then? What happens to the production of automobiles if the Russians don't send us the palladium and the nickel and the other items that the Russians are very important producers of in a world economy that depends? You got to be very, very careful. And let me drive it home yet another way. The Russians have begun to react. So far, the game has been all punching from one side and all reeling from the punch attributed to the other side. That's over. You know, Burger King ordered all the Burger Kings in Russia to stop functioning. The gentleman in Russia who runs the Burger King establishments returned the phone call with his middle finger uplifted. That ain't gonna happen, he said. And the Russians are now discussing nationalizing all of the investments that Western countries oh boy, and the Russians have an option. It's called China. And what is the United States going to do? Threaten China too? We're running out of options, and that increases the probability that what we're watching is a desperate theater of response, and that the bottom line is that Russia can do in Ukraine what it obviously felt it couldn't do when Poland, the Czech Republic, and all the other, or almost all the other Eastern European countries left their alliance with the old USSR and became part of NATO officially or unofficially. That kind of theatric, which is what we learned happened in Vietnam and in Iraq and in Afghanistan, great victories until you have to pull out. We should have learned that can happen in economics too. It always has.
Oddly enough, it seems like while this is portrayed as a moment of real financial economic strength from the West, in the neoliberal world, I shouldn't just say West, it's integrated all the way around the world. But rather than seeing this as a strength, oddly enough, it almost shows its fragility. Because I think up to this point, sort of led to believe that the financial world, and it's really remarkable how Russia has been cut off financially and from being able to do financial transactions, to be able to use a credit card. I mean, I don't even have money anymore. I use my debit card or my credit card, right? I mean, to suddenly have that completely shut off. We sort of took these financial transactions, I guess, a neoliberal world, as almost as being a natural resource in of itself that we'd expect to always operate smoothly, to be consistent. But now we're seeing there's no guarantee of that. It can be, unlike a river, this is a comparison I keep using, unlike a river that may flow through a country that people rely on, maybe it originates out of from another country and streams downhill, and if that country, to the north of you, I guess, decided to pollute the river or build a dam and redirect the river, that would have huge consequences for that country. But that's much harder to do. I mean, it's no small order to be able to do that. Where this, it's just a click of a few buttons.
That's right. Let me give another example to get us to stop mystifying all of this and getting lost in the hoop-de-doo of everyday, I'm about to call it news, but it really isn't much news left in the news. I want to talk about Germany. Germany was a remarkable phenomenon and is now, and is becoming more so with each day. First of all, it's the most important economy in Western Europe. Remember, I already pointed out, it's more than twice the size of Russia, even though it's a relatively small geographic country. The Germans were very carefully cultivating a relationship with Russia. They've been doing that for a long time. They export significantly to Russia, but more importantly, they import energy, which they don't have enough of, into Germany from Russia. Partly that's because the German Green Party is so powerful that Germany has renounced a reliance on nuclear energy and has closed all of its, I believe they're all closed now, nuclear reactors, and they're dependent, therefore, on renewables and to whatever degree still fossil fuels. And so they had that Nord Stream pipeline built from Russia to come into Germany to give them a kind of secure energy without which their economy cannot function, since it's a manufacturing, export-driven economic powerhouse. Okay, they were therefore not at all invested in being hostile with Mr. Putin or with Germany or with Russia. Quite the opposite. And given their complex history with Ukraine, it was clear at the beginning of this that the Germans would be a wobble in the middle. Then overnight, Germany's position radically altered. They announced that they were against Russia. They were for Ukraine. They would send military equipment, which they had earlier said they would not, to Ukraine. And why? Well, the answer was immediately obvious. Mr. Scholz, the new prime minister there, went to the parliament where he has a small majority and achieved what the German military have wanted for 30 years and couldn't get: the right to radically increase the German military. 120 billion euro, if I'm in the right neighborhood here, budget increase, which is staggering. Why was that done? Answer: that's the price the United States had to pay for being absolutely silent on the rearmament of Germany. That was the price paid by the United States for a switch in the German comments on Russia. But make no mistake, the objective of Germany here is not only about Russia. Germany has wanted to be the head of a unified Europe. One can go back not only 50 years, but one can also see the efforts of Adolf Hitler to achieve with military means what he couldn't. But with economic means, well, maybe you can. The Germans will now be the center of the European economy, even more than they were before, only now they will have overwhelming military dominance within Europe. And why? Because the Germans understand, even if Americans don't want to hear it, that the world is changing. Europe is caught between the United States and Britain on the one hand, and China and now also Russia on the other. They are acutely aware that one of those two giants is declining and the other one is rising, and they are not sure which way to go. Here's the irony. The rearmament of Germany is as much to prepare Germany for what might become a difficult relationship with the United States as it is with a difficult relationship with Russia,
or even just
China.
Or even just arming itself because it fears what the future holds.
That's right. And the United States should fear that also, because without the Europeans, the United States' decline becomes stark. And the Europeans become, yes, they're less than the unified US, and they're now less than the unified Russia and China. But they're going to have to play one way or the other, and that's going to be an enormous problem for them, for the Russians and the Chinese, and for the United States as well. But these are the real issues. We're not discussing the real issues in this country. We live in a fantasy of hoop-de-doodle theatrics about a war that's very far away. I don't mind, by the way, your parallel, Russia, Ukraine, David and Goliath. That's typical. David and Goliath that metaphor works at multiple levels, often at the same time. And I think you're going to see that here too. But let's keep a perspective which Americans have over the last century lost. When the United States invades Vietnam or Korea before, or Iraq, or Afghanistan, we are moving our troops tens of thousands of miles away. Russia only had to take a couple of hours to move its troops because Ukraine is a neighbor. Ukraine is right there. Ukraine would have been the last of the major dominoes to fall into NATO after Poland and the Czech Republic and all the rest. So in a sense, it was Mr. Putin and Russia saying, okay, you know, we were too weak to stop you since 1989, but that was 30 years ago. We've rebuilt, and we're now able to say, no more. that's a different move. This is not a justification, but it's a different political and economic move from what the United States did. We were defending a global empire. Russia doesn't have one and is therefore in a very different situation. It may try to get one, that's always possible, but it's not anything immediate on the horizon because they don't have the economic strength or the economic dependence or the military means to achieve such a thing. And if you think that's what they're doing, then the invasion of Ukraine is a very small, early, hesitant step.
What seems significant to me, and maybe unprecedented, is we've had financial warfare for a long time, but I'm wondering about at this level. And I say a long time, obviously, as you mentioned, there's North Korea, completely been cut off from the financial world. There's Iran after 1979. You can make an argument that Iran was part of it before 1979, but right. 1979 was a long time ago too. The world is different right now. Whereas what's happening with Russia here, and again, I will repeat, I think you could make an argument that this is how a country should be responded to if it invades a sovereign nation, that it wasn't under imminent threat. And we could debate what imminent threat means, but I don't want to get too sidetracked here. But again, the point is how is it used? Who and who decides when it's used and where it's used and you know where it's directed to? But I guess what seems unprecedented to me is with Russia and what's happening with not just economic sanctions, but cutting it off from the financial world, from being able to make financial transactions. Russia was fully integrated into this neoliberal world. And now suddenly it has been cut off. And one thing that's important in economics, in an economic system, is people's confidence in that system. People knowing that it's going to work, that if they put money in a bank, they're going to get some out, they have this card to use, whatever it may be. Confidence is vital to an economic system working. And if suddenly we go into an era, and I don't know what's going to happen after this, but suddenly if we go into an era where, and I know you could say neoliberalism has always been weaponized, but this seems to me to be on a new scale. If there is a loss of that confidence of this system actually working for someone, I mean, I couldn't help, but you've always said about capitalism, it's over. And I say this in the most loving way. I've always been in my mind, oh, come on, over? But as I'm watching this unfold these past couple of weeks, your voice saying it's over has been repeating in my head. I'm not saying it's over, but boy, it suddenly became more, it seemed suddenly more real than it did to me before.
Well, let me close today by picking up on your theme, if I may. I read the European newspapers a lot, partly because my parents were Europeans, and while I was born and raised and lived all my life in the United States, I've always had, like so many European immigrants to the United States, a certain affinity, a certain interest, a certain sense of the old country, as it used to be called. But I won't mention in which countries what I'm about to tell you has been going on. But I want you to know, and I want your audience to know, that in Europe, which is, if anything, closer to this conflict, what you just said is truer today than it was 4 weeks ago when all of this stuff started to unravel. And here's the way it's put. What happens to us all if the United States fails? If it can't do anything about whatever the Russians and the Ukrainians do or do not work out between them? What happens if the United States' economic warfare is as ineffective as its nuclear power has shown itself to be? It's there, but it can't be used, because if you do use it, it only makes the problem worse. The Financial Times is carrying stories asking whether the sanctions are not worse than what they were intended to achieve. Okay, here's the final step. What would happen if it's the United States that disintegrates, not the Russians? And of course, not because of their sanctions, but the sanctions looked upon as the last straw. A country already riven by political and ideological divisions that seem to get worse, not better. A country that has put its working class through 2 years of the worst public health disaster in the country's history, the worst failure to cope with that disaster that we have on the world stage today, and an economic crisis as bad as any other than the Great Depression of the 30s, now being followed by an 8% inflationary rate that is decimating what's left of the working class's financial capabilities. I mean, you can't do that to a society, the Europeans are saying, without stretching it. And now you are printing money like there's no tomorrow. You've been doing it for years. It's coming home to roost in this inflation. And now you are going on the warpath. You can't do it. The Soviet Union, they say, collapsed when it tried to maintain an arms race with the U.S., tried to control Afghanistan, tried to, and it couldn't do it and fell apart. That Europeans are worried that the Americans are in that situation, that should be the greatest warning shot across the bow of anyone who's thinking about this without facing the real fact.
Final 2 minutes here. If I were a world leader at this moment that was fully, and most are, economically integrated into a neoliberal financial world, I would right now start to think to myself, we need to see that it can now be manipulated, rightly or wrongly. I'm not even trying to put judgment on what they're doing in Russia. It just seems the unprecedented nature of it to me is what is concerning, that it's not as reliable as the tides going up and down, but it can be manipulated and changed. I would start to think I may need to figure out a backup plan, a plan B, just in case.
That's right. And it should make the libertarians amongst us wonder whether the ideology they've been producing over these years really was a fig leaf for what is actually going on and is now erupting into what is making you as concerned as you are about the unprecedented challenge that all of this represents to their ideology, but to the whole neoliberal notion of a globalization. All of that's gone. All of that's gone.
Richard Wolff is a professor of economics, also host of the TV and radio program Economic Update, founder of Democracy at Work, and also the author of many books. Richard Wolff, thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. And let me really congratulate you and KPFA and all of the folks in Pacifica who make these kinds of programs available at a time like this, just honestly facing what is going on as best we can is the surest hope we have of coming out of this in a better condition than we went in.
Thank you for that.